Facebook Live, expanding the audience considerably. And thank you again for coming and participating. So let's get the show on the road. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your weekly update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim. Today, we'll be highlighting the work of two museums deeply focused on the lives of enslaved people. Our special guests today are Ashley Rogers, Executive Director of the Whitney Plantation Museum in Louisiana, and Woody Keown, Jr., President and COO of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. And a reminder to Zoom attendees that we will take 3 snap polls during the show, and we'll announce results. And questions submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. So thank you both for joining us. It's just wonderful to have you. And I'm going to set you up simply by stating the obvious, that racism has been a factor in our world forever. And in America, it has taken different forms for Native, Black, Latin, Hispanic, Asian, and other peoples. So today we'll focus on the kidnapping and enslavement of Africans, the long march to freedom and equality for Black Americans, and how the resonance of our history affects us today. So Ashley, let's begin with you. We're going to talk about your institutions and this story through the eyes of your institutions. So tell us about the Whitney Plantation Museum, its origins, and your mission.
Well, thank you so much for having me. The Whitney Plantation is a museum and memorial dedicated to the history of enslavement in South Louisiana. We're located about 1 hour between Baton Rouge and New Orleans in what was once one of the densest plantation districts in the country. Historically, Whitney Plantation was a sugarcane, indigo, and rice plantation established in 1752 and in operation until 1975. It was purchased by a chemical company, Formosa Plastics and Fibers Corporation from Taiwan, who intended on building the world's largest rayon manufacturing site at Whitney Plantation. When the community resisted that, the deal did not go through, and they sold the campus of the plantation to John Cummings, our founder, who's a wealthy lawyer from New Orleans, who spent 15 years restoring it and opening it to the public in 2014. So we're now in our 7th year. It is a unique site, plantation museum in an area with a lot of plantation tourism that's been, marketed to the public in terms of the opulence of the plantation owners.
And the weddings and the events and so on and so forth, basically glossing over the fact that these were slave labor camps.
Yes.
To extract wealth from the lives and the lifeblood of individuals. And you've turned that story on its head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Whitney Plantation, our mission is that we educate the public about the history and legacies of slavery. Legacies being very important because our story doesn't stop in 1865. There's a long continuation of these kinds of practices after the end of slavery. It's in addition to being, a site where you can see things like the big house and slave cabins and all of the, external structures, it's also a memorial where we've built memorials that name and honor people who were held in slavery in the state of Louisiana. So it's just a fundamentally different experience.
The thing that strikes me is that if you take a look at the unfolding of this history, it starts with people being kidnapped from their daily lives. They're just like you and me, right? We're going about our daily lives, and all of a sudden, armed people come in, round us up, and start the transportation and the conversion into chains. And then you go, if you survive the journey, you go and you live completely sundered from your history, sundered from those that you know, and then trying to form new relations and building a culture. And then Woody, you celebrate the exact reverse journey, don't you?
Yes, we do. We are basically picks up the story in terms of talking about it's really a part of American history, Mark, but we talk about it from the lens of an African ancestry perspective, from the time that, Africans were enslaved over in in Africa, brought to this country in terrible conditions, and were enslaved here. Families were broken up, and people were used to provide free labor for a lot of folks. Became very, very wealthy and left a lot of folks behind in the process.
And this was actually a business model, right? And there were a lot of components to it, right? You had people of different ethnicities on the ground targeting population groups, attacking them. Then there was this whole supply chain of, and all these processes of first attacking, separating, figuring out who was going to be the highest value product, then productizing them, transporting. There was a whole logistics component, right? There were merchants, American merchants and British merchants, whose trade, their stock and trade, was simply transporting product and keeping that product alive, or sufficient numbers so that they can make a profit. You know, the issue of how we think about our own business activities on a global basis really does come to the fore, doesn't it?
Oh, with this, when you go back and look at the history of slavery and enslavement in the U.S., I mean, it really started many, many years ago in Europe and expanded to the United States, and the United States and also South America as well.
Right.
But basically, it provided the basis of a lot of American business models right now. And the essence of it was that a lot of people were getting free labor. And, we have some information that talks about how a lot of the business models in terms of inventory and profit of property, how people were, plan the market in terms of, supply, demand the market in terms of people as chattel property, and how they were using that basically to maximize profits for themselves, but not including the people who were involved at all. So it really provides a major business foundation model that a lot of businesses use today when you go back to the origin of what happened as far as slavery is concerned and the economics of slavery, which is really what this was really principled on, economic empowerment of a few people at the expense of a lot of other folks.
We're going to come back to how do you heal that aspect of how business functions? How do you heal that aspect of how society functions? But I'd like to get back a little bit to this idea of how culture is built and how the transition to freedom occurred, because there is also a myth that somehow people who were enslaved were freed by people who are white, who became disaffected with the idea of slavery. But that's actually not the case. Culture was actually created from within the African and then African-American community and promulgated, and these ideas of freedom and these actions that resulted in freedom really come from within the heart of that community. Ashley, could you talk about the experience of the Whitney Plantation and how this hope and these ideas of freedom were kept alive, and how culture was developed under the most adverse of circumstances?
Certainly. Well, I think that thinking about the moment of freedom in 1865, right? It's not really one moment, it's many moments over a few years, right? And this is a moment where you can understand what's happening. To me, to understand freedom, you have to also understand power.
And you're referring to Juneteenth. So this was when the last of those who were enslaved received word that they were no longer enslaved.
Right. After
that is the moment you're talking about. And that's the federal holiday that was just voted on by Congress and approved as a national holiday.
So the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, which is the legal end to slavery. Juneteenth is really a regional holiday specific to Texas and to these people. But, throughout the South during the Civil War, as the Union Army was coming through, there were contestations of power. And Louisiana is really central to that story because the Union captured New Orleans early on, 1862. And as soon as the Union Army is there, it is a fissure in this slaveholding block, you know? So enslaved people suddenly have their numbers to their advantage for the first time. They start walking off of plantations. They join up with the Union Army. We know this happened at Whitney Plantation. I know of at least one, and we're looking for more men who were enslaved on the plantation who fought with the Union Army for 3 years. Louisiana contributed more US colored troops than any other state because there were so many people enslaved there, and they were interested in and, you know, did participate in their own freedom making. During the Civil War, over 500,000 people left plantations. I mean, it was this mass exodus of people who were using this power dynamic change to grab something in a huge way for the first time. So those policies that come from above are really a reaction to what's happening on the ground. You know, in Louisiana, slavery had become untenable before 1865. Slavery ends in Louisiana in 1864 because people will not be enslaved anymore. And that's really, it's important to look at those moments where there can be a breakthrough because you understand what's been happening for a very long time. People have been waiting for this moment, you know, to capture.
There are techniques to keep people enslaved, right? Techniques of sundering education, sundering communication, sundering families. Woody, could you talk about how the Underground Railroad grew up? Because in many respects, if you take a look at what's happening now, for example, with voter suppression and this idea of not providing information, I'm referring here to the 1619 project and the educator who is not being granted tenure, at least for now, at the University of North Carolina. Some of the other issues surrounding the laws that have been passed on barring the teaching of ideas around race encapsulated by critical race theory and those kinds of things. How did the National Underground Railroad, how does it unfold the coming together and the countering of those types of strategies in order to create cohesion and then a network that transports people out of slavery?
Thanks, Mark. I mean, I think it kind of goes back to what Ashley was mentioning in terms of, and the question you asked around culture. The enslaved African Americans basically never really accepted, their at least for the most part, this situation they were put in, and so the situation in terms of this idea that I don't have any freedom of family. You know, when they came into the country, they were split up. And families were broken up, living conditions were horrible, and people just had that innate ability and desire to be free. And as a result, a lot of people risked their lives to basically try to get to whatever freedom, wherever that freedom was. And generally, it was to the north. And so a lot of slaves took chances, and basically tried to escape. Many were killed in that process. But that did not kill the spirit of wanting and a desire for freedom. And so what happened was the Underground Railroad basically became a network of allies. It was really the nation's first social justice movement. And it was a multicultural, multiracial, because some people knew slavery was wrong, but it was the law of the land. And after a while, some of these folks who decided that they could no longer sit on the sideline, decided we're going to get involved and try to do some things to help people to achieve this freedom that we're talking about because it's so wrong. And so this whole thing around people coming together in this resistance movement, even though slavery was the law of the land, people knew it was wrong morally, and people sought to do something about it, a few people. And over time, it's been a long process. We've had several different movements in this process of freedom that's taken quite a turn. And so the 1619 project, I think, is a great project that basically has kind of tied this together from a historical standpoint when this slave ship first landed in America in 1618 and how this whole process unfolded and what it has done. And again, it comes back to the economics of the country and how it made people very, very wealthy. But it came out of resistance movement from a lot of people in a lot of different ways, but primarily driven by the Africans who were enslaved and their pursuit and desire to be free and to do almost whatever it takes to make that happen.
Woody, could you educate us on the earliest origins of the Underground Railroad? Where was the inception? What date did you could you first identify a freedom process that connected to what was later called the Underground Railroad?
I can't remember the exact date, Mark, but I can tell you that the Underground Railroad started taking shape really, decades before we typically talk about it in terms of the 1800s. That's when a lot of people hear when the slave ships arrived. But the Underground Railroad, the network and the concept itself started, decades before, because it was kind of like the way the European economy was built. And so a lot of people, there was discussions about people who knew that it was wrong and they outlawed it in Europe, but they continued in some pockets in Europe to continue to do it because of the economic benefit to a lot of people. And then it came here to the U.S. So I would say it originated decades before it actually came here to the U.S. Before the 1800s here in the U.S. So I would say around the late 1700s timeframe. Is when it really became more prominently known to people and what was going on. It was predominantly a political fight at that time, and then when they started changing and outlawed it in Europe, the United States decided to continue. It was just at the beginning stages of making a lot of money for a lot of people here in the U.S.
And if you trace back the Underground Railroad, right, you have, it basically seems to go along a thread of trade as well as ideas, right? And then if you bring it up to a more contemporary time, right, there was the film The Green Book, which highlighted the travels of two people of different races, right? An artist and his bodyguard across the South. That actually traces some of those same roots. So these ideas really do have resonance. They're shaped laboriously by people who are enslaved, working under the most adverse of conditions, and allies. And over time, you're creating this conduit for change that can then expand beyond that route. In terms of this connection to today's events, how do you see, Ashley, the experience of a plantation that is telling a different story than this illusion of grandeur and grace that has been promulgated? How do you see that story connecting to today's issues with white supremacy, with the dialogue that we're seeing around racial tensions? What would you hope that people experiencing your facility come away with that informs their thinking and their actions today?
Well, we're just beginning to really think about that in a more formal way, and whether we give people maybe resources on their way out the door to think about. The way that I've always conceived of this is that I want people to leave the site and understand their world differently, to be able to read the news and understand things in more context. Because I think that people are definitely coming to us for answers. We know that because we see spikes in interest whenever there are major protests around Black Lives Matter, and that's been going on since the very beginning. I mean, Whitney Plantation opened to the public just a few months after Michael Brown was murdered. And so that's always been top of mind for our visitors. We have visitor reflection wall that reflects that in moments of national, strife, when people are casting around and trying to figure out their world and how this connects to the past, they come to us.
Who visits? And what are the demographics? Is there a white, Black, Asian tourist versus resident? How do you?
So
what's the configuration of the audience?
Most of the people who come to us are tourists or travelers to New Orleans, and that's just because of so we're in the middle of, it's still sugarcane fields all around us. Our community that we are situated in, is only 1,000 people. It's a very rural area. And the city of New Orleans has about 400,000 residents, but in 2019 got 20 million visitors. So necessarily by the numbers, we're going to get more tourists than we are locals, just because there's not that many people here. So we have about 85% of our visitors are coming from out of town. Many of the people who come to us are coming on kind of a pilgrimage journey, that they've come specifically, to see Whitney. They're not interested in the other plantations. Sometimes they're coming to Louisiana just to see us. In terms of race and age, our visitors are different from, a traditional museum that tends to get older white visitors. That's not really our audience. Our largest share are young adults. And we have about 40% African-American visitors. White people are actually not the majority, about 49%. So it's a big mix. We also get a lot of people international as well. So that's kind of come down because of COVID and restrictions on travel. But previously, about 20% of our visitors didn't live in the United States. So we have a lot of people who are coming from really all over the world, Europe, the Caribbean, Africa, and coming to learn about our story.
It's really interesting. We just took 2 polls. One was the question about whether people supported Juneteenth as a national holiday, and the vast majority agreed with that. The second poll, which is still underway, was when the last time people went to a museum or saw a museum exhibition that specifically focused on the legacy of slavery in this country. And we gave a number of different options. Never actually received 20%. Never having viewed such a exhibition is a big response, and I think that points to the failure of the discussion. And 20% said that they can't remember. So it's a big proportion of people who have never actually discussed the issue. Woody, could you talk a little bit about how you present the knowledge and the history that is represented by your staff and your organization to others who are visiting, and tell us a little bit about the configuration of the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. What we do is we have a variety of ways that we present our story. The main and more traditional route is to help people come to the facility, on-site visits, and we provide, we're not doing as much right now, but before COVID, we were doing guided tours. We have docents who do that. But as we got into COVID, we wanted to stay in touch with our audience. So what we did is that we have always been working in the virtual world, but we ramped up our virtual world quite a bit when we got into COVID. And that's helped us a lot, oddly enough. And I think a lot of the situations that were occurring across the US, like the George Floyd situation, really brought more attention to us, and it caused us to engage on a broader national level. We are a national organization. So we engage audiences virtually. We engage audience with on-site training program. We have diversity, equity, and inclusion training that we offer to organizations and individuals around the city. And we also have educational programs where we go and work with administrators, as well as we have a lot of, before COVID, a lot of elementary K through 12 students who will come in and visit the Freedom Center. So we have a variety of ways of doing that. We also have created virtual tours so that people can go onto our website and they can go and see a lot of our virtual programs. They can also do a virtual tour of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center by going online.
So you're looking at this as a full-on modern approach to not only connecting physically when people can visit the center, but also to create a dialogue that unfolds online and through other educational materials.
Absolutely. And I think it speaks to one of the things we pride ourselves on is being what we call a convener of dialogue. I think we were talking about this earlier, where it's important for people to get together and have this discussion, sometimes very tough discussions. And what we found, at least I found, is that a lot of people, where they may not be comfortable having those conversations in their workplaces, when they come into the Freedom Center, it tends to loosen them up. And we have ways and information that we share with them to open their eyes and open their minds. So yes, we basically really try to be that convener of dialogue and try to have engagement with our community and audiences on a local, national basis. Our audiences basically, or I would say kind of, it's a pretty diverse audience. It pretty much reflects about the demographics of the U.S. in general. We get visitors from out of state, but most of our attendees are in a regional from a regional market, probably within an hour and a half drive of Cincinnati. Predominantly, I would say probably a little more to the white side in terms of people who come to the museum, but it's a pretty diverse audience overall, and it's a international audience. We have programs and a website that deals with human trafficking, which is another form of modern day enslavement that we focus on. We have a permanent exhibit on that, and so that is really an audience that basically attracts. That feature attracts a lot of people from the international audience as well. But we're a national brand, really a global brand, and we have a pretty diverse audience that we reach both on site and also virtually.
One of the things that strikes me, I've read some of the laws and some of the text of the laws that were passed in Texas, kind of shocking, outlawing teaching in public schools of some parts of this story. It strikes me that if you took your programs and you transported them into a public school setting, that these new laws are making the teaching of these types of facts, that historical facts, they might not be the only perspective, because there are multiple perspectives in history, but the teaching of these facts are not only frowned upon, but are in some respects illegal, right? In other words, if you teach about, if you make the comparison to a plantation, to a concentration camp, and the extraction of labor under threat of death, right? If you make that comparison, you are suddenly required to show some sort of a counterbalancing perspective. I just don't get it. Could you both comment? Ashley, let's start with you. Could you comment on this whole idea of what in America we should be teaching as part of our public education? In other words, our civil society education about America, because we're not just one thing, we're not just one people, right? We have different ideas, we have different experiences. Shouldn't different perspectives be part of education? And how do you feel about this idea of legislating that you cannot teach a certain perspective? It's outlawed, or it has to always come with something else that basically places all facts in a relative position.
I think we should all be very concerned when state legislatures start deciding what is okay to talk about in terms of our history and what's not. It's a major concern. History is about power, and it's about the maintenance of power. And what you see in the conservative think tank that wrote all of that legislation that got passed in several states, it went up in Louisiana too, but it was defeated. If you read it, they don't even really understand what critical race theory is. It's a flashpoint. It's something to scare people who don't understand what the conversation is about.
Critical race theory, why don't you give your definition of
at the very basis level, critical race theory is the understanding that race has been an important factor in the history of this country. And you can't really look at the history of this country and deny that. I mean, it's actually impossible to look at everything that's happened in this country and say race didn't matter. Race mattered, and it matters now, right? And as our director of research at Whitney Plantation says, hidden history hurts. We're not going to get past any of this. We are not past it now, right? And we're not going to get there unless we actually deal with it. I think there's this idea that somehow acknowledging the truth of our history, which is about enslavement and genocide and white supremacy, these are not up for debate. Those are facts, right? Those are things that have happened here, right? But somehow acknowledging it makes it impossible to be patriotic, or to have love of country, or to have love of, fellow citizen, right? And we have to get past that, because all that's doing is just denying. I mean, if you think about your own personal life, when you deny your problems, what happens? right? They keep bubbling up and coming back and coming back. You can't get over it until you actually unpack it and deal with it. A couple years ago, I saw John Lewis speak, and he described history as a wound, and we have not healed it, you know?
Well, we just got an interesting point that was made by one of our viewers. Said that when you're teaching history, it should really be about all of the above. There should be the essential point was that there should be different perspectives reflected, and there are different truths. Each of those truths coexist, right? It depends on your perspective. It depends on what you experience. Woody, how do you see the connection between these laws, which are trying to create sort of one American history that is generic and that is patriotic and so on, as opposed to a multidimensional, multi-layered approach that might reveal different truths? And some of these truths might be in opposition to each other. How do you see what you're doing as part of this whole unfolding chapter of looking at America through different eyes?
Well, I'm with Ashley 100%. I'm very, very concerned about some of these laws. We are, as a matter of fact, have a law circulating in the Ohio State House right now on the subject issue. The way I see it, Mark, is that when you look back at the legacy of slavery and so forth, we have basically, the slavery has been perpetuated based upon the legal system. And laws that prevented people from being truly free, prevented people from voting, the Black Codes. Even though people were living in free land, there were things known as the Black Codes that basically denied them rights of things like basic rights, like things to vote and so forth. And my concern is that if people are not, I think it's important to have balancing perspectives when you're learning, but you need to teach the facts, and you need to teach all of the facts, I think, and not just one side of the fact. And that's what's happening. I can't tell you how many people come to our organization, and when our historians and docents finish the tour, as we go through, I didn't know that. I wasn't taught that in our history, in my history classes. Nowhere did I hear anything about that. Nowhere did I hear anything about what these African Americans did, et cetera, et cetera. And that comes from a lot of that. I think these laws are designed and intentionally designed to perpetuate the white power structure and keep people from knowing the truth, and therefore keeping people from understanding what real freedom is all about. So our intention is basically to continue to tell the truth. We will advocate strategically where we need to advocate to ensure that there's balanced perspectives and that people do hear other perspectives and not just one side of the ledger in terms of what America's history is all about. Because this is America's history. And again, it was perpetuated based on economics, and also highly supported and perpetuated by a very accommodating legal system that we need to be careful and watch carefully as we move forward.
I think it's really important that people take counsel of the work that you're both doing in your staffs and your board. The whole idea of just understanding a little bit better, and maybe year after year understanding just a little bit better than we understood the last year. Understanding and listening to different perspectives. One of the things that strikes me is that division only exists because people aren't listening to each other. Doesn't mean that we'll all agree. There's no way that we're going to find common cause with people who want to tear down the United States of America. But building up the United States of America also means telling its true history. And I'd like to thank you both for helping us to understand this part of the history, work that will never be done, but work that is advanced by both of your organizations, Ashley Rogers, Executive Director of the Whitney Plantation Museum in Louisiana, and Woody Keown, President and CEO of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your insights to us. And please thank your staffs and your boards for their fantastic work.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it.
Have a great day. Bye.